Unit 1, Class 1, Topic 2. Universal Grammar and the Learning and Teaching of Second Languages. Organization of the chapter. The chapter by Vivian Cook could be divided into two main sections. The first section deals with an overview of the principles and parameters theory of syntax and its relation to universal grammar and language acquisition. The second section, which we are not going to concentrate on, that's why it's in gray, is a discussion on the universal grammar model and second language learning and teaching. Though I'm not going to concentrate on it, I advise you to read it because the author repeats many of the concepts expressed in the first section, and this could be useful to understand the topic even better. Okay, the organization of this class is the following. I'm going to open the class by sharing with you a brief biography on Noam Chomsky as the father of the principles and parameters theory of syntax. Then I will move on to share with you some basic concepts on generative grammar and universal grammar. And finally, I will plunge into the discussion of Chomsky's principles and parameters theory as explained in the first section of this chapter. Noam Chomsky is an American linguist, sociologist, and philosopher who is still alive. He is an emeritus professor in the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Pennsylvania, in the United States. Chomsky radically changed the arena of linguistics by assuming language as a uniquely human, biologically based cognitive capacity. His influence on linguistics is similar to that of Darwin on evolution and biology, or to that of Saussure in linguistics. Chomsky argued that human beings were born with the innate ability to realize the generative grammars that constitute every human language. He called this innate ability universal grammar. Generative grammar has been under development since the late 1950s. The standard theory from 1965 is the original model, which he further developed as the principles and parameters theory of syntax in the 1980s. Chomsky's ideas have profoundly affected linguistics and mind science in general. Critics attacked his theories from the get-go and are still attacking them, paradoxically demonstrating his enduring dominance. Our next topic is a chapter you have to read by Steven Pinker, How Do We Learn Grammar and the Tower of Babel. Pinker is a very acid critic of Chomsky. He's a cognitivist linguist, and he's against Chomsky's ideas. He doesn't believe in the principles and parameters theory of syntax. However, we have decided to include this theory, first of all, because it comes in very useful to describe mainly, for example, the difference between English and Spanish as regards the retention or omission of the subject, for example. So you will see that during this year, we are going to introduce different theories which you may adhere to or not. But what is for sure is that they are worth knowing. Generative grammar and universal grammar, some basic concepts. Generative grammar considers grammar as an innate system of rules that generates combinations of words that form grammatical sentences in a given language. Universal grammar underlies this system of rules. Chomsky proposed that our brains are hardwired with a mental template for learning grammar. Children have unconscious access to this universal grammar. and this access guides them in the development of their internalized language systems. Thanks to universal grammar, native speakers can produce or judge sentences as grammatical or ungrammatical. Here I would like to remind you of the chapter we read by Randolph Quirk, in which he exemplifies how a 5-year-old boy produces a grammatical sentence that has lots of grammatical mistakes from the point of view of standard grammar, but which is grammatical. Generative grammar and universal grammar. Some more concepts. Chomsky spoke of linguistic or language universals shared by all languages. So, which are the examples of language universals or principles? The fact that all languages identify nouns, verbs, adjectives. The fact that sentences in all languages must have a subject and a verb. The fact that all languages express notions of past, present, and future. However, principles, language universals, manifest differently in each language and produce parametric variations. So, principles and parameters are highly abstract notions that interact with each other in complex ways. Now, we are going to move on to the chapter itself. First section. In the first section of the chapter, Vivian Cook introduces the principles and parameters theory of syntax in relation to universal grammar and language acquisition of the first language. So, as I have already said, principles and parameters are highly abstract notions that interact with each other in complex ways. Principles do not vary from one person to another. Principles are built in all minds. Parameters, or rather parameter settings, vary according to the particular language that the person knows. So they do not vary according to from one person to another, but from one language to another. So parameters are set to a particular language or languages. Let's analyze some examples. For example, the principle, the extended projection principle. The extended projection principle holds that all sentences must have a subject. Some languages permit sentences without subjects and are called pro-drop languages. For example, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, among many others. Other languages do not permit sentences without subjects and are called non-pro-drop languages. For example, English, French, German, among others. So, the pro-drop parameter that corresponds to the extended projection principle has two values or two settings, pro-drop or non-pro-drop. So, depending on the language you speak, you or the speaker will set the value of the parameter to pro-drop or to non-pro-drop. For example, English as a non-pro-drop language must always have a subject, even if this is non-referential, that is to say, even if it does not have an explicit referent, an external argument. What do I mean by this? For example, in the case of his going home, the subject, the syntactic subject is he, and this subject is referential because it has an explicit referent, which in this case should be a man, a male. However, in the case of it's raining, whose subject is it, or there's a book on the table, whose subject is the expletive there, and then we have the notional subject, a book. In these cases, the subjects are non-referential. That is to say, it is not substituting for any entity, any explicit referent. And the same goes for there. So these are instances of grammatical subjects. Here I want to make a point. In the chapter you had to read, on page 27, the author, there's something I would like you to correct, because the author speaks of grammatical subjects when in fact, I'm going to read. On page 27 then, in the middle of the page, second paragraph, it reads, let us now look at some parameters. In English, declarative sentences must have grammatical subjects, such as he, it, and there in the following sentences. I would like you to cross out he in his going home. In which sense? This is not an example of a grammatical subject. It's simply a syntactic subject. The only two sentences that illustrate grammatical subjects there are sentences 2 and 3. If you are in doubt, I can answer this question more in depth in the forum or in class. Spanish allows both the omission of the subject, because it is pro-drop, or sentences with no subject at all. So the translation of sentence 1, he's going home, could be va a casa. Él va a casa. You could decide to retain the subject pronoun, but that's not the usual choice in Spanish. So in sentence number 1, va a casa, this is an instance of what we call in Spanish sujeto tácito. There's omission of the subject, and we can recover the identity of the subject by analyzing the verbal inflection. So in this case, it could be él o ella. However, in the case of llueve and hay un libro en la mesa, we cannot say that this is a case of omission of the subject or sujeto tácito. Nada llueve, you know, this is an impersonal verb, una oración impersonal, there's no subject. And the same goes for hay un libro en la mesa. Un libro, it's not the subject, but the direct object following traditional grammar. And again, esta es una oración tercio personal con el verbo haber. No hay sujeto en este caso. These are notions we are going to review when we do the exercises. The principle of structure dependency. So we have finished with the principle, the extended projection principle. Now let's have a look at another principle, the principle of structure dependency. This principle operates on syntactic or structural units. So, questions, relative clauses, and passive constructions are structure dependent. That is to say, you will realize they are a statement is an interrogative statement because of the order of the elements. And again, you will be able to tell passive from active constructions because of its structure. That is, their grammaticality, the grammaticality of questions, relative clauses, passive constructions, or any other structure-dependent construction depends on the structure of the sentence elements that make them up rather than on the sequences of words in it. So, what is very important here is knowing, identifying the sentence elements. Which are the sentence elements? The basic sentence elements are the subject and the predicate. Then there are other sentence elements, for example, within the predicate, the object, the direct object, the indirect object, those are sentence elements. The main verb in the predicate, the head verb, that's a sentence element. Let's see. For example, Vivian Cook gives on page 26 an example that reads, "Is Sam the cat that is black?" And then he does the analysis. But I have decided to illustrate it with this other example, which is very similar but clearer, I would say. The boy who is standing over there is happy. In this first sentence, this is a complex sentence. There's a main clause and a subordinate relative clause. The boy is happy is the main clause. Who is standing over there is a subordinate clause. There are two finite verbs. The second verb in capital letters is the finite verb of the main clause, while the verb after is the finite verb in the subordinate clause. Native speakers of the language have no knowledge, are not aware of these grammatical labels. So, any native speaker, even if he or she has never been to school, will be able to construe a sentence like this, or produce, "The boy who is standing over there is happy." Should he or she want to make a question, he or she would produce the following. Is the boy who is standing over there happy? With no problem at all. The native speaker would never produce a question such as the following. Is the boy who is standing is happy? Why not? Because the rule says that if you want to make a question on this affirmative statement, which contains a relative clause, you have to front the verb in the main clause, which is this one, and not the verb in the subordinate clause. This is something that is known unconsciously, something you don't need to be taught at school. This has to do, according to this theory, with some built-in knowledge of language you have in your brain, with universal grammar. Let's have a look at another example. Passive voice. Scientists have not developed a COVID-19 vaccine yet. Passive voice, affirmative statement. Active voice. This is active voice, affirmative statement. Scientists have not developed a COVID-19 vaccine yet. If you turn it into the passive voice, the result will be a COVID-19 vaccine has not been developed yet. So, the noun phrase direct object becomes the subject. Again, any native speaker would be able to produce this sentence without having been taught how to do it. So, this has to do with the principle of structure dependency that is built in our minds. Nobody would produce something like scientists have not been developed a vaccine or have not been developed scientists a vaccine, which are ungrammatical sentences. Then Vivian Cook goes on to speak about Pollock's opacity parameter. Well, we are going to refer to Pollock's opacity parameter as the order of sentence constituents, the order of sentence elements, subject, predicate, direct object, indirect object, head of noun phrase, pre-modifier. So we are not going to use the term opacity parameter. It's just for a question of organization, and because the opacity parameter, the label at least, is a little bit outdated, so we'd rather speak about order of sentence constituents. So, these major word order parameters. It has to do with the differences in the unmarked position of sentence elements. That is to say, depending on the language you speak, you will organize the adverbials or the negative elements or the modifiers, for that matter, in different positions. Modifiers, multiple modification. This is in our syllabus. If you have read our syllabus, you must have seen this. It's one of the very big contrasts between the Spanish grammar and the English grammar. The fact that in English, head nouns can be pre-modified by multiple modifiers, while in Spanish, multiple modification exists, but it's postnominal. So the unmarked position in Spanish is postnominal, while in English is pre-nominal or attributive. But let's have a look at other type of examples. For example, negation. The negative particles that negate auxiliary verbs or main verbs. Vivian Cook compares French and English. John does not drink wine. In English, the negative particle not comes after the auxiliary verb it negates, and it must negate an auxiliary verb and not a lexical verb. While in Spanish, we negate by using the adverb no in front of a lexical verb. Juan no toma vino. In French, you have this kind of double negation, je ne bois pas de vin. I'm sorry for the pronunciation, but this negative particle is placed right after a lexical verb and not after an auxiliary verb or before the main verb. So this is a difference in word order that has to do with the position of sentence elements. Let's see another case in which we can compare the use of adverbials in English and in Spanish. In English, you can say, I like horror movies very much. So I like horror movies very much. Horror movies is the direct object of the transitive verb like, and the intensifier goes at the end, the intensifying adverb. You could decide to place the intensifying adverb before the lexical verb. I very much like horror movies. There are two possibilities. But you could not say, it would sound or be ungrammatical to say, I like very much horror movies. This order is typical, or at least it's allowed in Spanish, to place the intensifying adverb between the transitive verb and the direct object. So you could say, me gustan mucho las películas de terror. Or, me gustan las películas de terror mucho. But we would never be able to say, me mucho gustan las películas de terror. So these are differences as regards the position of elements in a sentence. Vivian Cook also goes on to explain that it's not only the syntax, the word order, that counts, that is important for understanding or for communication, but also the meaning of words. And this is something we have read in How Do We Learn Grammar? In the chapter by Randolph Quirk, remember, we analyzed some nonsensical string of lexical items, and we saw how important syntax is depending on the function of each grammatical word, but at the same time, he referred to the fact that meaning is also very important, that words have grammar among words and within words. So, for example, the verb faint, which is an intransitive verb, could be used with a subject, an inanimate subject. Peter fainted, but not with a non-inanimate subject. The rock fainted. We could have said the boy fainted. The boy, the rock. Two noun phrases that have the same or a very similar surface structure. The boy fainted, the rock fainted. However, the rock fainted is ungrammatical because of the meaning of the rock. It doesn't make sense. And then we could not say Peter fainted the rock because faint is an intransitive verb and does not project on a direct object. It cannot take on a direct object. So, Chomsky's claim is the following. Syntax is innate. So this universal grammar we are born with, this hardwired system in our brains. But vocabulary is learned. So in order to know that you cannot produce this, you should know the meaning of faint. And he says, there is only one human language, apart from lexicon. And language acquisition is, in essence, a matter of determining lexical idiosyncrasies. That is to say, he holds that languages differ in their vocabularies more than in their grammar. When you read the Tower of Babel, I would like you to bear this in mind. Please bear it in mind for the very beginning of the chapter, to see how you can associate this to what it says at the very, very beginning of the Tower of Babel. Okay, then Vivian Cook moves on to speak about what the initial setting for a parameter is. That is to say, we have said that, for example, in the case of the prodrop parameter, there are two possible values, prodrop or non-prodrop. So, all languages, there's a principle that says that all languages must have a subject, a sentence with a subject. But depending on the language you speak, you will set the parameter towards prodrop language or non-prodrop. But what is the original parameter when you are born? So, it might be that a child starts from a neutral parameter setting and then adopts one or the other possibilities. Which is the neutral parameter setting? Or it might be that the parameter has a default value. Default and mark setting, neutral are all synonymous. It might be that the parameter has a default value called and mark setting that children will retain unless something makes them change it to the non-default value or mark setting of the parameter. So non-default value, marked are synonymous. Default value and marked are synonymous. Let's see. How can they learn this? Let's go back. So we said, it might be that the child starts from a neutral parameter setting and then adopts one or the other. Or it might be that the parameter has a default value and the children will retain unless something makes them change it to non-default. So what can make them change the setting of the parameter? Well, it could be language evidence. That is to say, children need language evidence to find out the correct value. For example, in the case of the prodrop parameter, Vivian Cook holds that the neutral setting of the parameter is non-prodrop. That is to say that all children tend to omit subjects when they begin to speak. So, children who are native speakers of English have a tendency of omitting the subject at the beginning. But because of language evidence, because they will hear over and over again sentences with subjects, both with subject pronouns and with grammatical subjects, they will set the parameter to non-pro-drop. Now, this evidence can be positive. This is what actually occurs. As I said, they hear over and over again sentences with subjects, or negative evidence, and that is what does not occur. And negative evidence could be of two types: correction or absence. That is to say, their parents, in general adults, will correct them if they say things like want money or whatever, right? They will say, no, I want or you want. Or absence, which would be the opposite of positive evidence, what does not occur. The fact that they will not hear sentences with no subject. Okay, to sum up then. Principles and parameters is an approach to the question of how children acquire their first language. This approach started shaping since the early days of modern generative grammar in the 1950s. I said that at the beginning with the standard theory. Despite large variations, languages have many common properties on abstract level which are innate. These common properties are principles. So the fact that the structure dependency principle is one of them. The universal grammar model of language acquisition claims that principles of a language do not need to be learned, as they are already built into the mind. Remember the fact that nobody needs to teach you that a sentence must have a subject. You don't need to go to school. Parameters are built in the minds within principles. So parameters are built in the minds within principles. So principles is, let's say, like an umbrella term. Principles embrace parameters inside. But their values, the values of parameters, need to be set either to one option or the other option. The negative particle before the main verb or after the main verb. Learning a language has to do with tuning the parameters in different ways. So when we say that someone speaks Spanglish, when the word order we use, when we use English words but with Spanish grammar, for example, a student asking his or her teacher, Miss, you corrected the tests? That's a mistake that has to do with word order. So the student has not tuned in the parameter to the word order, typically in English, which would be to begin with an auxiliary verb. Okay, that's the end of the class. I have covered the most important sections in the chapter, but again, if you need any further explanation on this class, please leave your question in our forum. Thank you.